year-long series is intended to explore how some of those technological developments are affecting civic life. Not just conventional civic life in the halls of governance and so on, but more quotidian civic life in spheres such as work, the topic of today's discussion. And I want to thank Ben Shestakofsky, a member of the 10-person planning committee who has been working for the last 2 years or so organizing the events of the year-long series. I want to thank Ben for encouraging us to put on today's event, for helping us to organize it, and for generously agreeing to be its moderator. Ben is an assistant professor in Penn's sociology department. His work focuses on the very theme of today's discussion, the theme of how digital technologies are affecting the world of work. Ben is the author of a wide range of scholarly pieces. His research has earned him the 2021 Star Nelkin Article Award from the American Sociological Association, as well as the 2019 W. Richard Scott Award for Distinguished Scholarship, also from the American Sociological Association. And Ben is now completing a work on how venture capital investors impact the relationship between work and technology, a topic which speaks directly to today's discussion. I just want to thank also our partners at Perry Worldhouse, in particular Tom Shattuck and Michelle Jefferson, for their help administering the series this past year, and Matt Roth, my colleague at the Mitchell Center. And the last thing I'll say is simply to draw your attention to our final event next month on April 24. Estonian ambassador to the US, Christian Krik, will be addressing us, discussing technology in the context of security and defense. So look forward to seeing some of you there in a month's time. But now I'll turn things over to Ben, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks all of you for coming. I want to just take a minute before I introduce the speakers to sort of set the stage for our discussion. At the beginning of the last decade, we saw a rapid emergence of what came to be known as the platform economy. There was a lot of excitement at first, a lot of talk about how these new technologies would extend opportunity to people in a way that had not existed before. On the other hand, over time, I think at this point we all know that workers and scholars identified some big problems and questions about this new world of work, right? Questions about the power that platforms can exercise over workers, given their control over the infrastructure that workers were using, the opaque algorithmic management systems that were used to control workers, even at the same time that workers were generally classified as independent contractors rather than as employees. How platforms were able to take advantage of gaps in labor law to give workers low wages, no benefits, or job security, or working conditions, the fact that very often when platform companies were caught doing harmful or even illegal things, the accountability was not always there. So really pleased and honored to be here today to introduce our two panelists. Both of them have distinguished themselves both as scholars and really as public figures in helping to think through and debate and help people understand the path forward around some of these issues. They're here not just to talk about the problems with the platform economy, but also how there are still promising directions that it can take that really have the potential to benefit the many rather than the few. The first person I'm going to introduce, seated to my left, immediate left, is Juliet Schor, who's an economist and professor of sociology at Boston College. Professor Schor has published widely on topics at the intersection of work, consumer society, and climate change. By my count, she's the author or editor of over a dozen books, nearly 100 articles and chapters. And her award-winning books include The Overworked American, which was a New York Times bestseller, The Overspent American, and most recently, After the Gig, How the Sharing Economy Got Hijacked and How to Win It Back. Professor Schor has received numerous grants and honors, including major awards from the MacArthur Foundation, the National Science Foundation, a Guggenheim Fellowship, the list goes on and on. She's a leading public voice on working practices and how businesses can adapt to meet the pressing social needs of our times. And we're really delighted to have her with us today. We also have, to Julie's left, Trebor Scholz, who's He's a prominent researcher, author, and advocate who works in the areas of digital labor and economic justice. And his work is aimed at creating a fairer and more sustainable digital economy by supporting a world where workers have a say in the platforms that they use and get a fair share of the revenue that their work generates. Trebor is the founding director of the Platform Cooperative Consortium. He's played a key role in designing models for worker-owned digital platforms. We're going to hear a lot about that today. He's written or edited 3 books, including Digital Labor, The Internet as Playground and Factory, and Overworked and Underpaid, How Workers Are Disrupting the Digital Economy. He's received fellowships from the Open Society Foundation, the Berggruen Institute. He's also on the faculty at the New School and a faculty affiliate at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. So thank you so much to Trebor as well for joining us. I want to start the conversation here maybe with a little bit of history. It would be great to hear from both of you about, I don't know, your sense of, from your own vantage points, your own interest in this topic, where what we know today is the platform economy, where it came from, and kind of how you have seen it develop over time. And does either of you wish to go first?
Okay, this one.
The switch is there. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Ben. It's a great pleasure to be here and looking forward to this conversation. So I got interested in this topic when I was writing a book called Plenitude, The New Economics of True Wealth. That was in sort of 2008-9. And I was interested in thinking through how individuals and households could de-link from the corporate economy and work less, sort of back to that theme that I'd been working on earlier in my career. And at that time, you were seeing the beginnings of some of these businesses that promised people a way to earn money, like Airbnb or ride hail, then called ride sharing. And so I got intrigued with these. To ask where they came from, I think probably the one-word answer would be eBay, which is that a number of employees from eBay sort of got active on starting new platforms or working on these new platforms that were going to give people new ways to work and earn money. They were going to use crowdsourced information from customers to ensure quality, and of course they were platforms and digital. And there's a whole story about how what was earlier in Silicon Valley called the Californian ideology, or kind of sort of Silicon Valley ideology about all of the benefits that the internet or digital technologies would provide. I call it the idealist discourse, economic, social, and environmental benefits that were claimed for these new platforms. The economic were returning value to producer and consumer and cutting out the middleman, so cheaper prices for consumers, more value going to the workers. The social were that it was a person-to-person economy, an alternative to the big corporations, and people could actually make real, authentic social connections through this peer-to-peer economy. The other economic part, very relevant for today, is that it was going to provide workers with incredible levels of freedom, autonomy, control, flexibility, not having a boss. And so the kinds of heavy control that you saw in low-wage corporate jobs were supposed to be absent here. And then environmental, and of course this is the one, I think in our next question we're going to get into what went wrong, but just the idea that big platforms in transportation and travel, which were making those things much cheaper, but were somehow going to reduce carbon footprints was so implausible on the face of it. But I did the first random national sample survey of people's views about the sharing economy, and 66% of Americans believed it was good for the environment. So they did a really good PR job on the idea that it would bring a lot of environmental benefits. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a parallel story to what Juliet said. And so yes, I am a professor at the New School. I know this came. I don't know if this is on.
Is this?
I need to speak to
Yeah. There you go. Whoops.
Yeah, so I mean, the story. I mean, I worked on digital labor since the early 2000s, and in the beginning, there was this war around the language that's used, right? This sort of fog of war, I would almost call it, like, is this a platform economy or a sharing economy? In Europe, we would call it the collaborative economy. And there were these companies, right, like BlaBlaCar and Couchsurfing, that were non-profits initially, and that were a genuine sharing economy, right? Really people helping each other out. And this was then picked up in the, I would say, early 2000s by the Ubers and Airbnbs that built on these ideas and turned them into, brought this sort of venture capital to these companies. Sort of on the heels of the 2008 financial crisis, so people needed jobs, so they were really open to doing these games. And yeah, so that I think was sort of the beginning. And then you had like lots of this funding that came in, right? It was really directed towards influencing legislators, right? Regulators, like we saw in California, right, where Uber, Lyft, and Instacart spent over $200 million on exempting their workers from being employees, right, under the 85 regulation. So a lot of these funds basically were used to sort of form right, like a regulatory environment in which they can operate. So all of that sort of being part of a longer, right, like at least 40-year-long process of a shift of labor markets to the internet, and also a shift away from direct employment.
So we're kind of at a place where there are some, if not, well, let's say optimistic beginnings. There are some strains of thought about some of these developments that were optimistic, some potentially positive developments. But obviously we get from there to, you know, more pictures like what's behind us right now, where there's more of an awareness of, I guess, the kinds of exploitation that can be involved with the digital platform economy. And so I guess, you know, to follow up on what you both shared about the historical roots of these developments, you know, what exactly happened to get us there, to this growing awareness? Was it that the platforms were changing? Was it that people's understanding was changing and the narrative was changing? We had what's known as a techlash, often referred to as a techlash. You know, what exactly got us from those early optimistic beginnings to a time when these platforms are much more, I guess, widely criticized for their labor practices?
So one of the things I think we have to sort of understand about this is there's heterogeneity across this sector. There's what I've called the Uberization narrative, which is kind of Uber as the sort of poster child of the sharing, what was then the sharing economy, we call it the platform economy, and that all the other companies are just like Uber, and to one extent or another, it may be the sort of most extreme example. And the standard argument is that it's the pressure from the investors that starts to really sort of degrade labor and drives everything that's going on. So there's some truth in that narrative for sure, but let me just add a few dimensions to it. Number one, I want to put Airbnb aside, because Airbnb which was the, you know, other really big player in this sector, is a very different animal than Uber. And its story is different. It's a story where the people being harmed are the outsiders, and most of the insiders, meaning the hosts and the guests, have been pretty happy. You know, there's a little bit of a different story very recently with Airbnb, but its issues had to do much more with what it was doing to local labor markets and communities and the quality of life in the places where it grew really rapidly. I think one thing we have, so in the early days, and I started, you know, my team started studying these, interviewing earners in 2012, maybe a little bit earlier. You had lots of happy earners. You had really high wages, far, far above what people in these kinds of jobs could get. And I think a really important thing to remember, and it comes to be really crucial later on, is to remind ourselves that these are jobs which, I don't use the word low skill, I will use the word generalized skills. So these are jobs that require skills that lots and lots of people in the population have. Driving, shopping, delivery, you know, they're not scarce skills. These people have very little power in the labor market. They have very little market power. So these are labor markets that traditionally have been very difficult to keep up good conditions and good wages and so on and so forth. I think the key thing about Uber is that it never had a viable business model. And at the beginning, it had lots of cash from the VCs, and so it could pay good wages and so forth, and the whole thing was just to grow. But over time, as you know, a decade on, it, you know, lost $9 billion last year. I mean, it's nowhere near profitability, and it has to do with the fact that it's in an industry which has traditionally very low profit margins and hasn't really been able to succeed without barriers to entry. And unless we understand that about Uber, I think we're going to come up with lots of general explanations for what's going on that really miss that key thing. Very different from an Airbnb, which got profitable, you know, fairly quickly and has a viable business model. But whether we're talking about ride-hail or food delivery, these are both like super low margin services. And these companies have a lot of expense in the technology, and you know, Uber has an incredible shop of economists that it pays huge amounts of money to, so they have a lot of corporate bloat. So there's a kind of inevitability. I mean, they subsidize those rides at about 40% for year after year after year, and now they decided, you know, they went public, they're not doing that now. And of course, the prices are up to where taxis were, and they can exist as a, you know, reasonably sized company, but their big plan, which was to wipe out all their competitors and get a monopoly profit like Amazon and Google and Facebook and these other highly profitable tech companies did, made no sense. They're a local service, they have almost no network effects. It's just, it was all a Ponzi scheme from day one.
This has been your hand.
Do you want to add anything?
Well, I think it's quite complicated. We're also working in like India and Brazil and Colombia and Argentina, and so what platformization does in India is quite different than it does in the US, but that's not the topic right now. But you know, what we've seen is that, of course, so you know, the benefits are removed, you know, wages are low. There's a lot of physical safety concerns for gig workers, right? That are often actually stated as their first concern when you interview people. Also, it's really isolating, right? It's a really isolating experience to be like a food courier and so on. And so for me, right, like it was, the question was, I was sharing just a second ago this experience. I gave this talk to this big media conference in Berlin and talked about crowd labor, and it was just, it was just very dark material, right? It's like really like people making like $1 to $2 an hour, right, on Amazon Mechanical Turk, and they're novice workers, and so on. Right? So I saw these people sort of sink in their chairs, and I felt sort of like, well, this is not what I want to do with my life. This was 2013. And and this maybe relates to a bit of a problem in that area, right? Which where we have a lot of analysis, right? So you could fill by now, right? You can fill shelves with the books on the economy and critical analysis, right? And there's usually like a paragraph or a few bullet points in the end that sort of point us to responses, right? Like, what do you do about this situation? And so for me, it was really like I wanted to commit myself more as a researcher, but also as an activist, to actually changing it and to maybe thinking about ways in which they can be altered. And so one of the ways, and there are many ways in which you can go about that, right? One is, of course, through unionization, right? Or let's call it associational power between workers, right? Because traditional unions have kind of missed the train on the gig economy, so very hard to organize a distributed workforce and so on. And so there are some attempts of that, but their successes so far have been limited. And then, of course, there's regulation, and regulation, of course, is without it, as Juliet said, right? We cannot succeed without regulation, so that's key. But that also very often, takes decades or never happens, right, in that area. So when you look at the American worker from 1978, like to today, right, like where is the federal law, labor law, that has actually positively impacted their personal life, right, their work life. Right? Who watches out for the American worker, right? And so definitely not giving up on regulation, but also being honest about it and saying like, well, it's incredibly important, but it has definitely its limits, right, of reaching the worker. And then there are lots of other ESOPs and employee ownership solutions that you can look at. And so I grew up in East Germany and was lived and worked in cooperatives. So for me this was a very easy step to make, to say basically, hey, they have these 7 principles on how you run a business, so 7 cooperative principles. So what if you apply those to the digital economy? So I suggested that in 2014, and first an essay, and then like a longer essay, and then 2 books, and that really sort of exploded, really all over the world. Like we have 500, over 550 companies, and 50 countries running those businesses now. Some actually the tertiary ride-hailing service in New York City will soon be, or you could say is already, drivers cooperative with 8,000 drivers co-owning this platform from 91% immigrants, right, immigrant workers. And this is something that like venture capitalists and would tell you, oh, that could just never happen. Like workers could never run a platform, and not just workers, but like immigrant workers, right? And here they are. They raised $3 million. 8,000 people. They have run 200,000 rides with their company. Did I say they raised $3 million? Yes, I did. And so pretty impressive, right? So it seems to really work, and it's different in all kinds of sectors, right? But like there is something that is by all means flawed, right? If you know cooperatives, of course, right? They are not a worker paradise. But in comparison to what, right? In comparison to what, and also especially, what is the time horizon, right? So like when we think about people suffering right now, right? This driver making, like very low wages, right? Like what can we do about this, like within a month, 2 months, a year, And so there's something concrete that people can do. So this is what my research over the last 8 years focused on, and so we're working with many groups around the world, in 60 countries, on developing this. We have a research institute with right now 33 fellows, mostly PhD students, writing on these topics, and it's like super exciting and very positive, right? Going back to my 2013 experience. Yeah.
So maybe since you introduced this concept of platform cooperativism, even, I'm not sure if everyone in the audience even is totally familiar with just the principles of cooperative businesses in general. Maybe you could unpack that a little bit, tell us about what is distinctive about a platform cooperative business, and maybe if you could get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of how these things come together, how they are actually operated in practice.
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing there is that you will probably, especially the students here, it'd be actually very interesting to see, like, so the students here, like, who has ever heard about co-ops in their classes? Exactly. So they are left out, right, out of curriculum in law schools, in business schools, and that's quite strange, really, because over 55% of agricultural products that you have in the United States are touched by cooperatives, right? You have 41% of the United States is electrified by rural electric cooperatives. That, coming back to the point, 1932, right, Roosevelt wrote legislation to support and to make happen, right? So these big ones were really, like, came into being through regulation. And, but usually this is when people, encounter crisis, and there is the market and the government and even families and communities can't help, right? They fall through the cracks. And what do? They turn to each other and start, a business, right? So this is in 1844 when the first recognizable co-op started. This is what happened. They couldn't feed themselves, sort of amidst industrialization in the north of England, right? The same place where unions emerged, right, out of the guilds. So you have a response. These are consumer cooperatives, right? Very important, I think, is that there are two strands to that, which is they are not at all ideologically homogeneous, so they are not, as you may think, maybe your association may be socialist, leftist even, right? Far from it, really, right? So there are really people who are just, I would say, half of this movement is really dedicated just to economic well-being. They want to feed their families, right? They could very well be, supporting political parties that not many here will support. And on the other hand, there are, of course, people who want to bring down capitalism, right? So, and this sort of contradiction existed from the beginning and still exists today, right? And so how are platform cores particularly different? Well, I'm just finishing a book on it, so there's a lot to say about this, but there is, of course, you can divide co-ops in two camps, right? So if you Google this topic, like, you will find like 5 cooperative types, but you can really say it's 2 types, right? It's consumer cooperatives and worker cooperatives, right? That will tell you the story pretty much, right? So REI is hardware, right? Those cabbage cheese, right? Like these big, huge American cooperatives, right? But what does that really mean, right? Like, I'm sure many of you are members. Does that really change your life? I don't know. Worker co-ops absolutely change people's lives, right? They are much, much smaller, so there are just 460 of them in the United States. But in other countries, right, like in Finland or in Kenya, right? Kenya, 48% of the GDP, right? In many countries, in parts of Italy, it goes up to 60% of the GDP is cooperative, right? Okay, so but now, platform cooperatives. Question is like, can you do this online, and what does that look like? And I guess we are experimenting with that. What really like a cooperative means is that 2 things, right? It's about ownership, right? So all the workers own the company equally. One worker, one share, right? So there's no seniority or like people having more money owning more, it's equal. And the second thing is democratic governance, right? So people have a voice, right? And the same voice. So I worked in a cooperative university for the last 7 months, and it was a very different environment than the universities I'm used to, because it really didn't matter what anyone thought about you, because all they had was really a vote. Your dean, 1 vote. Provost, 1 vote, right? So a student or whatever, 1 vote, right? So like everybody. So this creates an entirely different human relationship, I can tell you. So I don't know. So how do you bring this to the internet? people try, right? And care, and so there are groups of cooperatives in New York that are immigrant women, and they banded together, in their work cleaning homes, and they found that when they had an app, right? And again, the story, right? Like when you look at the numbers for who supports, how venture capitalists support women-led teams, right? So I think it's around 6%, like single digit. Right? Now look at how many groups of women are supported that are immigrant-led women groups, probably vastly smaller. Yeah? So here they are, these women, right? Recent immigrants, mostly women, see this one guy, and they did it. They started this home cleaning platform co-op in New York City, and they're making twice as much as they did before. Care workers in England, twice as much when they switched to this model, right? Not in all sectors. So, like for example, at drivers cooperatives, they make $30 an hour. So maybe to speak to how this is different, because it's they support each other mutually, right? So it's a cooperative. They decided that basically if somebody has a slow day, they should be supported by those who have lots of rights. So they are paid $30 an hour, and which is unheard of in a gig economy, right? And they're not arbitrarily fired, which happens of course in Uber, right? Somebody makes the wrong move or has a finger that's a little bit too big, then they press the wrong button and people get fired, right? So that doesn't happen in a co-op, but I should stop.
Well, let's kind of keep the discussion going about co-ops. Julie, I'm going to put it to you, but we can come back to you, Trevor, if you want to respond as well. You've been thinking about alternative models for work and consumption for years, and I guess I'm interested in your perspective on platform cooperatives, kind of on their potential, on their limitations. Certainly, democracy can be messy, right? And not only that, but tech companies can be expensive to run. Clearly, venture-backed tech companies, tech platforms are going to have far more resources than any cooperative will ever have. Is it possible for platform co-ops to succeed at any sort of scale? If that's going to happen, do we have to kind of cut down the power of big tech to let platform cooperatives bloom, or is this more a situation where they can successfully function alongside the big platforms that are already out there? It's kind of, what's your view of this landscape and its potential?
Yeah, great question. So I was really interested in the work that Trebor was doing when he began talking and writing and organizing around this. And so my team did a study of what at the time was probably the most obvious platform co-op to study in North America, which we really didn't have other choices at the time. It's a photographer's co-op called Stocksy, and it was extremely successful. So they did stock photography. It had about 1,000 photographers at the time we studied it. And these are the things that I learned from it, or that we learned from it, that I think answer some of your questions. So the first one was that they solved what are two of the big issues for cooperatives. I think the first one, at least what the literature would say, is financing. And so they were founded by two entrepreneurs who had started a stock photography platform and sold it to Getty, who was the Amazon of stock photography. So they had money. They loaned that money to the new. What happened was at first they were working for Getty and everybody hated it. So they decided to start this. So they got a loan from these founders. The second thing was that they had a lot of expertise because they'd already been in this industry, they knew what they were doing. That's something like the drivers also. If you start a drivers co-op with drivers, they know a lot about the industry, but that's key. I mean, I think back to many of the people I met in the early days here who were like idealistic graduate students or just, you know, developers, and they wanted to start these things, but they had no expertise in these industries. They were very successful, I would say. So they were global, which created a lot of complexities for governance. I wouldn't say they lived up to all the democratic governance principles, in the sense that about 20% of the people participated in the governance and the others didn't care that much. On the other hand, nothing was happening that got them riled up either, so they were at least happy enough, and that's probably not that unusual for many cooperatives. They had a truly extremely unequal distribution of revenues. And that has, so the revenue distribution on this platform is worse than the American wealth distribution, and I'm sure everyone.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
Because I was wondering, also when I was reading it, I was wondering about that, but you need to acknowledge so that they are not going in with the same intention. So there are photographers who are hobbyists, and they want to make, as you quote the one guy who wants to make whiskey money, right? In your book, you quote one of them. But then others put on $100,000 photo shoots, right? And
not 100, but yeah.
Yeah, this is group in that grade, yeah. So, right. So they're very different intentions. So I was wondering about, because I remember also back in the days we talked about this, and you commented on this, and I thought, like, well, what's the problem with that, right? I mean, they go in. The idea is not to have an equal distribution of wealth.
I didn't say it was a problem. It's just, it's really important because it's very different than most worker cooperatives, and it's something that's very key to platform cooperatives because it's not a common production process. So the conventional, the offline worker cooperative, they're making a common product, and so they share out the value of the product much more equally, not completely equally, but much more equally. And they, you know, they can make decisions about that in a way that's much harder on a platform co-op where you have individual contribution. Now, the thing about a driver's co-op or a house cleaning cooperative is that the differences in earning power are going to be much smaller than for a photographer's cooperative, in which you have a talent dimension, as well as the other divide that we found, which is common on many platforms, which is people who are, in that paper we call them hobbyists, but sort of professionals versus hobbyists. So people who are there for, you know, a few hours a week earning versus people who are doing it full time. And when you have open access platforms, which many in the platform economy are and some cooperatives are, you're going to get that distribution. If you have closed membership, I mean, Stocksy is a closed membership. They had that also. So it has to do with it's one of the ways a platform cooperative is sort of different, and one of the things you need to think through, which is individual contributors versus a common thing. Now, what's interesting about the drivers is that they said, okay, we're going to have some portion in which this is common, right? And we're going to, if you didn't get work, we're going to give you $30 an hour, which means that the people who would be earning more than that are going to get a little bit less. And so that's a solidaristic principle that's a lot harder to achieve on some of these platforms where you have more variation in individual earning power. So I never said it's a problem. It's just it's a feature that you need to think through and figure out. Like, are you okay with that level of inequality in a commonly governed entity, or do you want to do things to try and reduce that, or, you know, it's just a feature of platform cooperatives. But one last thing I want to say, especially if we think about ride-hail and food delivery, these sectors where you've got these great big powerful players. And so Uber, the drivers cooperative, as I understand it, part of what has helped it to be successful is that it has a contract with the city, and that gives it a certain amount of market. Very hard to get these markets. If the big players decide they want to crush the co-ops, they can undercut the prices kind of unlimited. You know, they can do that when the co-ops are small. I mean, Uber and Lyft aren't doing that in New York, and maybe the contract is key, and maybe we need to think about the ways in which municipal governments and entities need to be there to maintain a certain amount of demand for these co-ops, because they're up against very, very deep-pocketed competitors so it's really hard. I mean, we haven't yet seen a case where a co-op has really been able to, you know, drive an existing platform out of business. I don't know the answer to your question. I mean, I think what seems pretty clear is they can coexist with the big ones. Europe, the situation, I think, is different in other parts of the world. I mean, Trebor knows better than I, but where you have much stronger co-op traditions on the worker side, I think it will be easier for them to grow and take larger and larger share of the market. It feels like, I mean, I'm a big supporter of these things, but I think that they need, in order to really grow and get significant, they are going to need finance, they're going to need marketing help, and I think those municipal entities can really make a big difference.
Absolutely, right? So that's exactly, I totally see that too, and that's exactly right. So you see that happening in New York City. So they are right, they're running this program for people with disabilities, right? So that gives them hundreds of rides a day, so it's supported by the city. And you also see it in Bologna, right? Like where the city convened the ecosystem from the university to the unions to the co-ops to shopkeepers to the library to say, like, what do we do with this pandemic? What do we need, right? And they created basically a Venn diagram, and in the middle, shows up like a platform co-op. That's what they wanted to do. So they did not start it, but they facilitated it, right? And the same you see in Kerala, in the south of India, where the government has committed itself to building 4,000 of these companies, and is right now building one for an agricultural sort of platform co-op network, where they basically bring together these tiny, tiny farmers, which are very different in India than, or at least in Kerala, than they are in the US. So 0.1 hectares per farm, so that's like a tennis court, right? So that's about the average size of a farm. So they aggregate all these 11,000 farmers and small banks all into this cooperative network, to make it easier for them to act like a big company going to market with their zucchini, with their vegetables, etc. Right? Which gives them a huge advantage, of course, than compared to being a family going to a market. Right? So that's this exactly what Juliet says. So I think this role of municipalities and governments, I think, is really crucial.
One other thing I would say that we found in our study of Stocksy was complaints. It has to do. We call it the tyranny of the market. But the cooperative solution works on the supply side, so it changes the conditions of workers and the supply of these goods. The demand side also has an impact on things that happen. And in the photographer's case, the complaint was the kinds of pictures that the market was demanding. And they were demanding pictures of affluent, white, Western consumers. And so, okay, people all over the world were able to meet that demand, and they could produce those pictures, but it's a kind of neo-imperialism that it didn't matter what the organization of work on the supply side was. These co-ops were being subjected to that sort of, racist demand from, it's mostly companies they sell to. So we also, I think, where we're thinking about sort of reimagining work and consumption in a connected world, sort of thinking about that consumption side and what is the consumer demanding, and do we also need to make changes on that side because there is a tyranny that consumers can subject workers to that can be problematic.
Yeah, thank you. That gets me to a question that I do want to ask. You know, we've talked so far about what workers are doing to build alternative organizational forms in the digital economy. You both touched on things that governments are doing to support these emergent platform co-ops to help to build their market power. What do you see as the role of consumers in bringing about these sorts of transformations to build systems that are more just and more sustainable? Is there a way that you see of organizing consumers, of reshaping consumer needs or sentiments? Is that a lever that should also be pressed, and if so, how? Or is it just simply too diffuse a population and too complicated to try and press there?
Yeah, I can jump in. Just briefly, so yes, right, of course, right. So awareness and sustainability and fairness and equity and all these things people should be aware of. And I wanted to just jump back for 1 second to the previous comment because, like, I think so. We have like this library on our website, platform.coop. We have like 1,800 articles about this ecosystem, about 900 papers and books, podcasts on platform co-ops proper. And I would say like 85% of them, frame the key proposition as bringing down Apple and Google, and right, which honestly like has not been my understanding at all, right? So I have yet to see people in crisis that come together to then destroy Google, right? I mean, so this is just not why people form co-ops, right? They don't form co-ops to wipe out monopolies. They form co-ops because they want to solve their problem, right? Like it's self-help, right? It's autonomy, it's self-help. And so I think this really gives this whole like discussion like a really different color, right? Because it's the example of the rural electric cooperatives, right? So, well, the utilities, this was just too expensive to go to rural Montana, right? It didn't pay to go to Illinois, like so, Kansas, and so people had to help themselves. Right? And I think this is a little bit similar. This gives a really different understanding, I think, of what is happening there, right? It's the same like what I mentioned in Kerala, right? Like these farmers, right, are very ineffective of going to market. Now they create, with the help of the government, this network, and boom, right? That works much better. So it's not really about, like destroying the local agriculture companies or so, right? It's just like about surviving and creating sustainable businesses. Yeah. So that gives like their sort of place in the economy is like it's different, right? So I think they exist and they coexist, right? And but it's not really, and they very much can, as we see from these examples, right? Like, yeah, well, this is the history of cooperatives, is coexisting with corporations. I mean, it's not the goal to destroy the big tech companies, but by virtue of existing, they are diversifying the digital economy.
So I think there's in terms of the consumers and the co-ops, there's an important role for consumers in the early days of co-ops, which is that you have a segment of the consumer market who is willing to support co-ops because of what they're doing for the workers. So, or because they're more sustainable, or they're values-based consumers, and those exist everywhere. And I think that segment has grown in the U.S. and so forth. So it's a key sort of early market for cooperatives, and it's a part of how cooperatives often, not a stock seat because they're to business, but a ride hail or a house cleaning cooperative and so forth. They can go to those consumers who believe in sort of treating workers better and so forth, particularly as, you mentioned sort of people thinking so differently about the Ubers and Lyfts of the world now. I'll just say one thing about consumers though. This comes from my more recent work in the COVID era with gig work earners, is how much mistreatment by consumers and also malfeasant behavior by consumers has come to be a much more common experience for gig workers. And so I think, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately is how one of the, I think, less remarked upon aspects of the platform companies is because they don't have legal responsibility for the consumers. They're not taking any or very little moral responsibility for the consumers. It's just created a much bigger problem of harassing, abusive, aggressive, fraudulent, all kinds of bad behaviors by consumers to workers. If I'm running a hotel and somebody comes in and starts abusing my staff, I'm legally responsible to make that stop, and the companies are taking no legal responsibility, and it's actually turned into a big problem.
Thank you both for that. I want to switch gears just because, Julie, we have you here, and you're working on a new project that really speaks to major questions about how work and consumption can be reimagined. And you're currently leading an international team that's researching trials of a 4-day work week in 6 different countries. So I just wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about the movement for a 4-day work week and kind of how it relates to these broader questions we've been talking about, kind of around building a more just and sustainable economy.
Yeah, thank you. So I've had a long-standing interest in working hours, but when I first got into this topic in the 90s, I tried to find some companies that were willing to, reduce working hours for employees without reducing pay, and I was going to study them, and I couldn't find any who were interested. I had a few interested, just nothing panned out. So. 4-day work week, and here we're not talking about a compressed work week, we're not talking about 4 10-hour, we're talking about 4 8-hour days with no reduction in pay. So these are people on 5-day schedules going down to 4. It was sort of bumping along pre-pandemic, kind of anecdotal level of, there were some companies doing it, but nothing much. The pandemic really dramatically changed things on both the desire side from the employees, but also willingness from the companies. And I was approached by an NGO that was planning to start 6-month pilot programs to help companies do this. And so I assembled a team to research it, and we're actually our 7th trial in South Africa. It started this month, and so we've had thousands of employed workers, maybe about 200 companies at this point, and we have plans for a lot more, and we've had really fantastic results. Tremendous improvements in well-being for the workers, and the companies are also basically saying people are as productive in 4 days as 5. That's part of the whole model, so that they're not taking a financial hit. Some of them, a good number of them talk about how they're more productive because they sort of sit down and figure out all of the stupid stuff that's going on, and they figure out how to, be more efficient and so forth. What's interesting about this to me in part is how much it's a sort of business-led rather than just a union-led. And of course, that was there in the earlier work time reduction movements. We all remember Henry Ford. We're not yet at the point where sort of unions and workers are really putting in a big push. I think that's maybe going to start soon.
I think it's a really fascinating topic, but I also want to make sure that we have time for questions at the end. So I hope that people have questions about the 4-day work week that we can throw in the mix. I'm just going to ask 2 more questions of both of you before we open it up. The first one, you guys are both, you're distinguished researchers who also engage in various ways with activists, with practitioners, with policymakers. And I'd like for you to give us some insight into basically how you think about balancing your work in all of these different areas. Like, how do you think about what should be driving your agenda? And, for younger scholars who are out there who also are interested in a more, I guess you could say, more balanced portfolio, in addition to their scholarship, of doing this kind of public work, what do you say to people who want to have that kind of impact beyond the ivory tower? Maybe we'd start with Trebor.
Wow, that's a very long, could talk about this for a very long time. I guess, so, I'm driven by my own sort of sense of purpose, right? So what I want to do in the world. And based on that, I think what I learned over the years was to be just very clear about my role, right? Because that's very easily, that can very easily be misinterpreted, or when you work so much with communities. I really talk to communities, like, or to groups of people starting these businesses, like, almost every day for like the last, almost 10 years. So, and so what is our role there? So, we are researching, right? And we do community organizing. So we do these 2 things. And so right now, for example, we have a program, we call it a platform called School. Like, I don't know, we just unionized, had a big strike at the new school, and they call it the, Union School, and we got inspired and took that. But the model is really like to combine everything we are good at, right? So we are good at research, we have this research institute, and we are also very good at bringing people together around this way of working around the world, right? So we have an annual conference, last year in Rio, in Hong Kong before, in Berlin, this year in Canada, in India, usually in New York. And so, we're good at we're combining these things, right? And trying to just be very aware of what we are good at and just try to not do the other things. And also to understand, I think the world literature is full of that, right? So already, Frankenstein, there's so many books of sort of people who tried to change the world and failed and got bitter, right? And so obviously you want to avoid that. So I think a key insight then is also that you really can make a small mark, right? But you're not going to change everything, right? So it's a big, there's so much to say about that. I think it's very, very hard for people to. I try really to support. Part of starting this research institute was to kind of support people like me, right? And honestly, it wasn't very easy in academia, right? Because academia tends to really emphasize, you analyze the thing, right? You look at the apple, you describe the apple, you cut it in half, and that's where you leave it, right? But to actually say you want to, commit yourself, right? I think this in itself is already very much frowned upon, right? Like to commit, right? How could you commit? There are so many downsides. And to really then also support it, right, over years, right? It's not something that academia looks upon in a very friendly way. So we're very lucky to be at the new school where that, they've been extremely supportive of that. But so we try to create a culture where that is supported, right? Where young people are working in this way. This is how we attract these PhD students.
Sure. So, I haven't thought about this question in a long time, but it reminds me, I'm reminded of some things that happened to me when I published The Overworked American in 1992, and I think you might have mentioned it was a bestseller. And I remember one very, very distinguished, one of the early Nobel Prize winners in economics, tell me, you're in trouble now. And Ken Galbraith saying to me, "You made a big mistake. You should have talked to me. You never should have published that book before tenure." And so the idea was that if you did that public outreach, you weren't going to get, it was going to be bad for your career, everybody, for whatever reason. And I think that's really changed. I think that for earlier career scholars now, it's a positive to be in the media, and their universities want it, and I think that departments want it, and so forth. So that's like one positive thing, and that has to do with kind of publicity and media and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't be as afraid of it. You have to do good work. That's not a question, but do your good work, and if you want to get publicity for it, I don't think it's going to hurt you anymore. But I think the key thing is, like, your work making a difference in the world, and if you care about that, and that's something that I always have, then go out in the world and work with people who are also interested in what you're doing and have a similar vision and are going to try and also work to make those changes. Now, Trebor started an incredible movement all around the world. Very few people can do that, but I mean, what I'm doing on the 4-day week, which is working with an NGO that believes in this stuff, and I've co-founded NGOs that sort of their mission was very aligned with my work and so forth, and all of that, it's really gratifying, and it's if you're called to do it, and if not, you just do your work, and other people will pick it up and take it out in the world. I mean, it really is. I've always been a person who, had an activist orientation, so for me it just felt natural. But if that's who you are, I wouldn't worry about it in career terms or anything like that.
So thank you both. I'm going to ask you one last question. Maybe if you could just try to take only 2 or 3 minutes to answer, just so we can make sure we have adequate time for Q&A. We all know that for a very long time, new technologies have been kind of at the center of both utopian visions of the future and also dystopian visions of the future. Clearly, based on what we've discussed today, there's a lot of potential out there to transform work and consumption in ways that will be beneficial for the many rather than the few. But also, clearly, there are significant challenges, significant gaps between potential and reality. So when you close your eyes, or maybe you don't want to close your eyes, but that's fine. When you imagine what you would like to see the world look like in 10 or 20 years, what do you hope to see, and what do you think would have to happen for that vision to be realized? Sorry, that's a hard thing to answer in a couple minutes.
Who wants to start? All right. Well, okay, so maybe, big vision, I think for me, is clearly it's like a pluralistic digital commonwealth, right? This is something I'm dreaming about. So to see that, because, I think, we talked so much about co-ops and platform co-ops. They are not a panacea, obviously, right? So it needs a pluralistic approach to lots of different actors. So we need this like small private unionized companies, as well as platform co-ops and ESOPs and B Corps and all of that sort of functioning in parallel. But also worker-led platform cooperatives and I think what's really important is that there's a sort of global connection where there's so much work in Web3 now, so many people interested in this intersection of Web3 and cooperatives, but any of this really only works if you want to change supply chains, right? There needs to be, so if you want to also work with really want to create a commonwealth where these groups are cooperatively organized around the world, and this, in a digital way, also requires that there are shared standards and a data commons, right? so that this actually can actually work, right? Like quite technically. So that's definitely when we started, they're not going to be 2 minutes. So, and I think through this digital commonwealth, I think would be my answer.
So when I think, did you say 20 or 30 years down? 10, 20, I think climate chaos. And I think what's happening with the destabilization of the climate and other ecosystems around the world is going to be really key to how technology is used. And the dystopian path is authoritarianism, Fortress America and Fortress Europe as well, and Fortress Japan, and the use of technology primarily for surveillance, coercion, control, and a lot of really ugly things that if we don't get it together to address what's happening to the planetary ecosystems, we are not going to be able to have the happy, sort of utopian technological outcomes that got me interested in platforms in the first place, which is the fact that they give the possibility of a lot more freedom and autonomy, efficiency, and control to people, as well as, you know, on the ecological side, you know, can really help us with the transition to a decarbonized economy and society. But so much of it depends on the sort of political road that we take. And, you know, I've always been a person who thinks about technology as not something that is driving and is really the context. And so that's the context that I'm worrying about.
Okay. Well, thank you to both Trebor and Julie for this really fascinating conversation. We're going to open up for questions. I think, Matt, are you going to go around with the mic? Yeah. Okay, great. So Matt will recognize you.
Thank you very much. If today we're dealing with our confounded expectations and optimism about the platform economy, and if remote work today is roughly where the platform economy was a decade ago, what are the confounded expectations that we'll be dealing with a decade from now, particularly in terms of remote work with surveillance and isolation in regards to remote work?
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen some really ugly kind of systems coming in with remote work. But what's interesting, I mean, and this goes back to sort of where I started in the very first question, saying, you know, kind of about Uber and general skills, and you got to think about the labor market and labor market power and so forth, is the differences between the people who are powerful enough in the labor market that they're telling their companies to shove it, they're not coming back to work, and the companies are just having to, like, you know, become flexible in ways that they really didn't want to, versus the ones who are being exposed to those, like, incredibly intrusive surveillance systems within the home. But I don't know. I think the labor market trends are interesting. I mean, we have in you know, many of the OECD countries sort of longer term outlooks that look very positive for workers from the point of view of the labor supply side. You know, lots of retirements, we've got long COVID, people not being, you know, needing those jobs as much. Of course, immigration picture changes that because it could bring a lot of new supply. But I do think that, you know, like always, it's the sort of how much power do workers have in these relationships, and when they don't have power, they're subjected to more technical control, and when they have more power, they're able to fight it and sort of, you know, push back. People keep asking me, well, if the companies could get if they could get these workers to be as productive in 4 days as they are in 5, why don't they just get them to be that productive in 5 days? And the answer is, well, they can't.
multi-platforming as well, right? Like, but to a much lesser degree. And like with driver's cooperatives, for example, like in the beginning, it's like well, just to be specific about it, like with that particular company, when they started, of course, you have this problem, right? Like you can build any app you want, right? Like, and this doesn't really go anywhere, because once even if you can market it, but you still need the labor supply, right? You need the drivers, right? So we are working with one platform group in Los Angeles that says before they have 5,000 drivers, they're not even going to start. Right? They're not going to publicize the app. Because people use it once, and if it doesn't work, they will not use it again, right? So it has to work right away. So the drivers got that problem too. So, in the beginning, there wasn't so much demand, so they had to, of course, use other companies, right, as well. But I think what a big selling point is really is actually retention, right? So like for many of these companies, especially in cleaning, home cleaning, right, they have an incredibly hard time retaining workers on these platforms, right? These cleaning platforms. And so that's where those cooperatives really come through, right? Because they band together, they're often smaller than friends, right? So they're socially closely knit. And I'm not sure, does this really speak to your question enough, or what did I not understand the nuance of it?
So I'm just curious about if workers have to conduct multiple types of work in their daily life, they might suffer from time poverty. Why it's very difficult for them to have time devoted to one platform, one corporation, and that's why it's unlikely for them.
Well, so there's this saying which is not particularly, beautiful, but people say like co-ops are like snowflakes, right? And they're like snowflakes because they're not two of them are alike, right? And that is because they are so local, right? And so they are very different, right? And so so it's very difficult to make like any generalizations about that. But you have these beautiful, one of my favorite types of organizations in the Italian mountains, where there's huge depopulation, right? So that's that happening all over the world, right? So, but also there. And so what happens is that they found community cooperatives, right? And they do everything. So speaking to your point, which is they might look after the sheep in the morning, then they run the restaurant, and then in the evening they project films in the cinema, and they're also operating the post office, all as part of one single cooperative, right? So really what they are doing is, it's again, like the state kind of abandoned them, right? Like many of these municipalities are abandoned, and so they help themselves, right? And somehow create these really almost, well, it becomes quasi-political organizations that take on everything. Right?
That's fine, I'll speak up. Thanks so much for your broad-ranging and insightful comments. You've been asking very, very big questions that our speakers have been trying to give very condensed answers to huge questions. In that spirit, two things going forward are the caring economy and the green economy. And I'm just wondering if you might want to comment on how the themes that you've developed thus far might apply in those topics. One of the things I like about the discussion so far is that you're very clear on this, it's all context specific. And those are two, I know they're very broad contexts, but if you care to comment on either of those dimensions going forward.
I can take it, then you can go. So yeah, two really important things. So we have been studying, I was talking to Julia about it earlier today, in my current project, we've been studying child care workers on care.com, which is kind of the Uber of the care, and then Facebook, people doing informal Facebook matching. And we find very little impact of the platform. I think that I see sort of limited potential for sort of platforms doing much in the care economy. I mean, I'm just not seeing it, because you've got these alternatives that work reasonably well. So that would be my sort of first thought on that. And I think this is also like that larger point that so many people, when the platform economy came up, thought, oh, it's going to change everything. And it just did, it wasn't a perspective that made a lot of sense, because it didn't think about the specifics of, how like a ride or a food delivery is very different than lots of other things. For the green economy, most of it is material. And there will be platforms at use in companies that are doing, whether it's manufacturing or agriculture or whatever, but most of the change has to be in the way we actually relate materially to the world. So I don't see, kind of like a huge opportunity there for platformization, if we want to call it that. But to get back to the point I made about Ben's last, question on dystopia, utopia, the longer term, if we don't transform our relationship to the material world, we're going to be in very big trouble. So, and I think we will. I think we will.
Thank you for the presentation. One theme that seems to come out of the conversations about power, market power in particular, right? So like when workers have market power, things are good for them, and platforms work for them, whereas when they don't have market power, platforms tend not to work for them, or they tend to suffer various problems. So it really is it mostly that the technology itself is just a medium? It's not particularly about, say, platforms of internet, any kind of technology that we can imagine here. It's more about the overall system that creates market power for some workers, not for others, produces the tyranny of the consumer in some cases and not in other cases. And how would you deal with that if you're trying to reimagine work? I mean, one of the themes that comes out again is like, you talked a lot about codes, ways of regulating companies so that workers are protected, and so on. Again, having to do with power, both of the market and of the state. You could encourage codes through public policy. You could impose regulations on some of these companies to protect workers in particular ways, and so on, right? So is it really that simple, or am I misunderstanding the sort of the tenor of the conversation?
So I suppose it's not that simple, but I mean, part of my emphasis on this is to push back against a lot of the literature, which is very technocentric and just thinks, oh, it's all about the algorithm, right? Or it's all about the VC money, and that sees the platform as a kind of all-powerful entity. And that's part of why I started by saying there's too much Uber centricity in the discourse, because Uber has been a powerful company in its sector, but I think that's sort of problematic when we think of the longer term, because I'm not sure it can continue the way it has been. So the market context, I think, is really important. It's not to say that the technology does nothing. The technology can do various things. It can create new services. It can create efficiencies. It can free workers up in some ways. It can surveil them in others. So there's a lot. But I think that we always have to be mindful that the way sort of the sort of impacts of technology, both what technologies get used and how they get used, etc., are always conditioned by that questions of power between workers and employers. And my vision of sort of how to make things better for workers is, it's sort of multiple things. It's a combination of cooperatives, regulation, unionization. I think all of those are probably necessary. That I can't sort of see my way to an ideal situation with only one of those, or even with only two. I think you're gonna need, and even those three might not be enough. They might also need a lot more political power in this country anyway.
I can just, I mean, I think I completely agree about the technocentricity. So we also found that, well, two things maybe. Like one is, I think participatory processes are always first, right? Participatory processes, then the technology, right? And second, and maybe this links to what Juliet said, but going also back to the New School, you know, was started by some Columbia University professors, right, in the early 1920s, with wonderful ideals, right, like no tenure, and it's like all this, if you read it, it's like pure utopia, it's a wonderful values, right? And today, well, it's really a corporation, right? And really acting like a private corporation, like we had our, I don't want to talk too negatively about the New School, but like the lesson there for me was that unless these values are enshrined and cemented in organizational structures, they don't really mean all that much, right? So, and I think this was really like my lesson. This is a big lesson for co-ops, right? Because in a co-op, in a worker co-op, really doesn't matter, right? Like people have to act in a particular way because the structure forces them to, right? You can't, you know, like mission creep the democracy out of a worker co-op. Very hard, right? But you can very much do that when you write like a nice pamphlet, right? And you know, Hannah Arendt speaking out against tenure and all that's all great, but like, you know, how does that really, you know, live on, right? Unless there's
Good afternoon, Professor Schor. I'm Captain David Blumdizzi. I'm in the United States Army and a graduate associate here at Perry Worldhouse. I am extremely interested in the 4-day work week and running a pilot program inside of the Army to see if there's an application that we could find. I'm mostly motivated by the research that I think you turned up on how it worked well in the healthcare industry, which is surprising to me. Do you think there are any industries where it wouldn't work as well? Maybe some features of industries where it presents some challenges?
Yeah, so there are some where it's harder, where you have to hire up new people for the off day. But in a lot of those, like healthcare, you're already paying tremendous costs in burnout, stress, people leaving, etc. So it's less costly than it seems. So I think it can probably work. We have people we're working with who are doing it in billable hours companies, which you would think, how could it possibly work there? But you know, like the snowflake theory, these companies kind of figure it out. So please be in touch and we'll see what might be possible in the US Army. That would be pretty cool.
Okay, so thank you to both of our speakers for joining us.